Over the next several weeks, the American International Podcast will be exploring some of the films that AIP presented exclusively in their television packages as part of their American International Television Division. Many of these films were imported from foreign markets, others were made specifically to be included as part of their television packages, and a few were picked up from other domestic distributors following their theatrical runs. In this series, we will be looking at films that are associated with the AIP as a result of being presented in these television packages.
We're not talking about actors. We mean a real monster.
I brought her back. She'll live and I'll get her another body.
I know they're going to catch me, but don't let anyone see me like that. Please, doctor, help me!
Biologically speaking, it's of primary importance that man should want to mate. Hey, that
You don't get all your kicks from surfing, do you?
We want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded.
You think you're going to make a slave of the world? I'll see you in hell first.
The American International Podcast.
Are you ready?
Hello and welcome to the American International Podcast. I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And I'm Jeff Markin.
Join us today as we look at a familiar yet unfamiliar film, Zontar, The Thing from Venus from 1967.
Zontar, The Thing from Venus was directed by Larry Buchanan, written by Larry Buchanan and Hillman Taylor, from the screenplay It Conquered the World, which was written by Lou Rusoff. And they also swiped some of the music from Ronald Stein for this movie as well.
Zontar, The Thing from Venus stars John Agar as Dr. Curt Taylor, Susan Bjurman as Ann Taylor, Anthony Huston as Keith Ritchie, Patricia Laney as Martha Ritchie, Neil Fletcher as General Matt Young, Warren Hammack as John, Colleen Carr as Louise.
Also appearing are Jeff Alexander as a rocket scientist, Bill Thurman as Police Chief Brad Crenshaw, Andrew Traister as Sergeant Magalari, Jonathan Ledford as Gate Guard, George Edglley as Mr. Ledford, Carol Gilley as Alice, and Bertha Holmes as a townswoman.
So as we've basically explained, Zontar, The Thing from Venus is a nearly shot-for-shot, line-for-line color remake of American International Pictures' classic black and white film, It Conquered the World. The movie was produced as part of AIT's television syndication package, chiefly so there'd be more color films available in there.
Zontar, The Thing from Venus was included on 2 different television packages. It was released as part of AITV's Sci-Fi 65, which included a whopping 65 different titles, and Amazing Adventures 67, which did not include 67 titles, but was available to stations in 1967.
There are some clever naming tricks there. So when we watched Zontar, having already seen It Conquered the World and done an episode on it, we're basically trying to note the differences between the 2 films, as there are very few differences in the trajectory of the story. But here and there are some things that Larry Buchanan applied his own signature filmmaking style to.
Right away, the opening scene is a little different. Both films start in a control room and the launching of a satellite, but what happens therein is a little different between the 2 films.
There's a graphic that comes up and gives us a specific location for this launch. We're at Zone 6, United States Orbital Rocket Control and Tracking Station. But the setup is the same. There's a $50 million project, this time called a laser satellite, and it's going to be shot into orbit.
This is all established when John Agar, as Dr. Curt Taylor, enters. He's our Peter Graves surrogate. He doesn't wear a lab coat like the rest of his technicians. And another difference between this and It Conquered the World is that the character Keith Ritchie shows up here, and he's our Lee Van Cleef stand-in.
Keith has come to interrupt the launch. Whereas in It Conquered the World, Lee Van Cleef's character comes in and speaks to the military brass in an office. Here he marches right into the control room. There's no security stopping him.
It probably means one less set to build.
I'm sure that's a proximal cause. He still prattles on about the same thing that Lee Van Cleef did in It Conquered the World. The aliens are just not ready for us, or we're not ready for them, to conquer space.
And just like in the original film, it doesn't matter because the satellite is launched.
But what we see is a little different. There's actually a flying saucer orbiting above Earth, and we get to see it, courtesy of another camera situated who knows where, in space, shooting an exterior shot of the satellite.
There's actually a cutaway to a slightly different angle, which means they have at least 2 cameras mounted somewhere in space. And then we cut to dinner at the Ritchie's house.
There is one prop here that I don't think would have worked in It Conquer the World. Keith's wife, Martha, is standing underneath an eyeless portrait of herself. It's extremely creepy, and it seems like it would be more at home in a horror movie than this movie. And it probably is laden with some kind of significance, but given the way the rest of the movie plays out, I think that's giving it way too much credit.
So, like the original film, Curt is trying to pick Keith's brain. He says that the satellite has been in orbit for 3 months now, and there has been no incident. And doesn't he feel foolish?
They're out smugging each other. I think Keith wants to puncture Curt's balloon by hinting at some big secret that he has. That's going to mean some kind of peril for the satellite, if not the rest of us.
Martha, his wife, who is not Beverly Garland, begs him to keep quiet, but Keith feels that he can trust Curt, and he's just been busting to tell somebody.
To show somebody.
So Curt follows Keith out of the room, and Anne, who is Curt's wife, tells Martha not to take it personally.
I guess she's used to being ignored by her husband, and maybe Martha should be too. So Keith has the same setup that Lee Van Cleef's character did. There's a radio transceiver set hidden behind a curtain, and when he opens the curtain, Curt is appreciative, but I don't think he really thinks anything of it.
Keith tells Curt that he's been talking to someone on Venus. That's pretty much Curt's reaction, too. And they communicate through a kind of telepathy through radio waves.
Keith calls it hyperspace hypnotism, and he understands it, even if nobody else can. Curt decides to humor him and asks, well, what's this creature's purpose? And does it have a name? Is it even a he? It could be a she or an it. And it conquered the world. And Keith is able to answer one of these questions. He doesn't know what the purpose is yet, but it does have a name, something that would sound like Zontar to us humans. And then there's a huge, loud music cue.
And that is interrupted by a phone call. It's for Curt. It's the laboratory informing him that the satellite has vanished.
Keith at this point dials the smugness up to 11. And Curt tells Anne that they gots to go. After Curt and Anne leave, Keith deduces that Zontar satellite jacked the ship and will be using it to arrive on Earth soon.
We cut away to the lab where the technicians are trying to regain contact with the satellite, but they can't find it.
General Matt Young is there to represent the military, and he's upset that they can't find it because this is the scientific achievement of the century, and probably because he's going to be in a lot of trouble. Back at Keith and Martha's, Martha's begging stupid Keith to try and act normal for once.
Then we're back at the lab. Curt has arrived, and he tells his crew to send a report to Washington through scrambled transmission.
It's all top secret stuff.
And suddenly, the satellite is back online. Curt requests that they contact the Pentagon and let them know that they intend to bring it down for examination.
I didn't know you could do that. Just have the satellite just decide to land? I thought they just degraded out of orbit. Eventually. But this one apparently can be driven to and fro.
I'm sure that doesn't cost much at all.
Well, that would make it the scientific achievement of the century.
So back at Keith and Martha's house, Keith is on his transceiver talking to Zontar. Keith tells Zontar that he's his only friend. No one else even believes he exists.
Getting kind of a Harvey vibe here. Martha's wearing a billowy yellow nightgown, and she comes to beg Keith to come to bed. But he's prattling on about Zontar stealing the satellite, taking it to Venus and boarding it like an Uber and riding in it back to Earth. Somehow Keith thinks Zontar is coming to save us, but Martha thinks he's crazy.
She again asks him to come to bed, but he wants to stay up and wait for Zontar's arrival.
He's monitoring his progress, like when you're waiting for your Uber driver to arrive.
Apparently it takes a really long time to get to Earth from Venus because next we see Keith has fallen asleep.
And Martha brings out a little blanket to cover him up, like a toddler who fell asleep on the couch. So we learn a little bit more about the technology in the next scene.
Yeah, we're back at the lab, and General Matt Young is back on the site.
He's harassing the control center Q, but they claim that their cycloid computer can do no wrong. Except the satellite's under its own control now and not theirs.
No, it's not doing what it's told to do, and it's going on its own course.
And Washington must be notified. And they lose contact again, for the last time.
Keith, on the other hand, has maintained contact with Zontar, and Zontar has kept him abreast of all of his achievements. Keith relays to Martha that Zontar has landed the satellite in a cave, and they couldn't even track him.
I just wonder how an entire spaceship, it's not really a satellite, could drive itself into a cave. Normally they have to splash land in the water so that they don't cause great damage. The science is really sketchy in this movie. That's what I'm saying.
It's not enough to concern Martha. She's just going to go shopping.
Well, he does tell Martha that the coming of Zontar means there will be no more wars, disease, all the bad stuff that plagues Earth. But Martha forbids him to spout his nonsense to Curt, as Keith so wants to do. And we find out why Zontar picked that cave. And though we never see it, this very capacious cave is over a hot spring, which is enough like the Venusian atmosphere to keep this creature alive.
Alive and able to do its nefarious deeds.
And it does. One very nefarious deed. This is different from It Conquered the World. We get a little more, I don't know if it's stock footage or if they actually shot footage of people trying to use tools, train stopping. We don't see any like accidents or anything.
Electricians are stuck in their buckets.
Right. Yeah, they're stuck in the cherry picker. They can't get down. We just see some real world examples of what would happen if all the power stopped. Because that is what Zontar has somehow managed to make happen.
And everything stopped. Curt and Anne's car has stopped running. Curt goes to check the engine, and Anne notices the car's clock has stopped as well.
As has her watch, and that is basically lifted from It Conquered the World.
Back at the lab, General Young wants to know why everything has gone dead. The scientists assure him that it's just a power failure, and they'll have it back up in a moment.
Curt's run out of options on what to do with the car. There's no way to start it. They think that since they're close to Keith's house, they can just walk. And so they do. Now we're in town where a cop is talking to, I wrote down a man in black. It looks like a character from MIB. And they're just discussing expositionally what's happened. Everything stopped. Then we see Anne, who, as she said, was in town. She comes up to the cop, and the cop very woodenly says, "Your husband predicted this. What does he think is going to happen next?" And Martha doesn't know, so she can't answer that.
But Keith does. He's back on his transceiver talking to Zontar, and he's letting Zontar know that the mayor, the chief of police, General Matt Young, and Dr. Curt Taylor and their wives are all that will be needed to be controlled to take over the whole area.
That's similar to the movie, but what's different is the little drones that Zontar is going to birth are called injectopods in this movie. They didn't really have names in It Conquered the World.
We cut back to town, and there's panic in the streets. I'm not sure why, just because nothing is working and everybody is concerned.
It probably just looks good. It's a panic scene, and
nobody's carrying a saxophone.
Yeah, that is the most disappointing thing about this movie.
As everybody's running, Keith suddenly winds up there. He finds Martha and tells her to come home with him because his car still works.
And then an old woman comes up to the police chief and also very woodenly complains that her husband's in an iron lung and it's not working. And he tells her to go home and crank it by hand, and he'll try to get some help.
And she just stands there and looks around, trying to figure out how to crank things, I guess. We cut away to Curt and Anne, and they're still on foot walking to Keith's.
Curt's holding a stick, which will come in handy.
Yeah, because one of those injectopods flies by.
It briefly menaces him. He throws a stick at it, and then it gives up and flies away.
Keith and Martha return home because you can go a lot faster when you have the only working car in town.
Keith is trying to explain to Martha his elite status amongst all of the humans. He tells her how everyone else's stuff is not working, even the water. Martha doesn't believe him, so she goes to run the hose, and it works. And Keith gloats that, well, yeah, of course, our stuff works. And then, for no reason, we cut to Keith and Martha coming back on the porch as Curt and Anne arrive.
Keith invites the newcomers in for a drink, and they all go inside.
Keith is just radiating smugness here, so Curt tries to get him to spill his secret. What is he not telling us?
Back at the installation, one of the scientists is talking to the army guards. He's looking for General Young, and they tell him that the general is out walking.
Very unusual for a general to do. These two are meant to be the Jonathan Hayes and Dick Miller characters from It Conquered the World. Like comic relief, they fail utterly. They're not funny. One of them has a terrible Brooklyn accent, and I cringe every time they appear on screen. And I think the only useful information that we get here is that even the hand crank devices don't work. And that comes from the scientist.
And then we go out to where the general is indeed out walking when the injectopod intended for Curt comes at him. He shoots at it twice.
His gun works. Just pointing that out.
But it gets him anyway. He then picks up the injectopod and buries it by a tree.
They die as soon as they bite you, inject you, whatever. Now we're back with Curt, Keith, Anne, and Martha. Curt still doesn't believe Keith's malarkey, but he's kind of humoring him. Why isn't Keith fighting this Zontar? Keith says that Zontar is going to save us from ourselves, even though he doesn't know the master plan just yet. So it transpires that across the entire world, everything mechanical, electrical, functional in any way has been disabled.
Except for General Young's gun.
Except for General Young's gun and Keith's stuff. So you have to wonder, is not the entire world in a state of complete chaos at this point? Nobody has water, nobody has power, everything that requires that. Power plants, nuclear plants, if they had, did they have them back then? I don't know. It's got to be the end of civilization as we know it outside of this town, but they never really addressed that.
Curt asks Keith to drive him to the lab. Keith says that it's useless going there, so then Curt asks him to take him and Anne home instead.
After Curt and Anne leave, Keith tells Martha that he knew that Curt would take the news logically. He is a scientist after all. And Martha tells him that he took the news logically because he thinks you're nuts. Then Keith snaps at her for her lack of faith in him and his kooky scheme.
She leaves the room, and Keith makes a quick call to Zontar to tell him where to send Curt and Anne's injectopods.
And he informs Zontar that Curt is going to be a difficult one to take over. So the now compromised general marches back to the installation, and he tells our comic relief soldiers that the entire area needs to be abandoned. They're going to decamp to the hills, the army that is, and all the personnel are going to be relocated under protective custody.
He wants them to move out at 4:30, but their watches don't work. The general's does, so he gives the guards his watch, so they'll know when it is 4:30.
Then he goes into the installation and tells the crew that there's been a communist uprising. They're under protective custody now, and they're going to be relocated as the base is abandoned. The general dodges their logical questions like, how did the commies make their watches in Crankstop? And how did he find out this information if there's no satellite that can transmit information across the country anymore? And the phones don't work.
Well, he does say that he got the information through a special courier that made it through, but he doesn't elaborate.
It was a pigeon, a really fast pigeon.
So now we're at the home of Curt and Ann Taylor, and just like everywhere else, nothing is working. And they start to wonder if maybe Keith was right.
Well, Curt doesn't entertain that for very long, though. He surmises that this is just a misinterpretation based on Keith's monstrously offended ego. Keith really wants to be right, and so he's trying to make the facts fit the situation, rather than the other way around. So unscientific.
And then we see that Keith is once again talking to Zontar. We can't understand what Zontar says, but Keith can, and fortunately for us, he repeats everything that Zontar tells him for our benefit.
One thing we learn is there's a 12-hour wait for the next 8 injectopods. I don't know why they need 8 more when we've only seen 1 actually flying around. So there should be 7. They're supposed to go to the chief of police, the mayor, their wives. Maybe some of them have been deployed, but we don't see that.
We're back in town. There's panic in the streets, and somehow sirens are blaring.
And there's a sound of a railroad gate clanging, too, in the background.
Maybe Keith owns it. And we know it's after 4:30 because we see that the soldiers are on the move. One of the soldiers, one of the ones we saw standing at the gate, notices an injectopod flying around, and he tells his companion that he sold a funny-looking Boyd.
So the panicky town has now come to the attention of Curt and Anne. Curt walks from his house to town, which is not that far, and grabs a guy who's running, but the guy's not going to explain why he's running. He's just got to get out of there. Curt heads back home and grabs his bicycle out of the garage. He tells Anne that he's leaving and that she should stay inside. He's going to the installation. She begs him not to, but he just brushes her off and leaves. She just stands there looking very offended. She's used to being ignored by her husband.
Next we see Police Chief Brad Crenshaw being injectopoded.
He tosses his dead injectopod in the garbage.
He walks directly to the newspaper office and tells the editor, Mr. Ledford to leave because he's the only one who's not running in a state of panic and evacuating.
The editor refuses to leave. He says, I've been here my whole life and there's nothing you can do to make me leave. So Chief Crenshaw says that, well, they don't need newspapers anymore. People aren't going to be reading in this brave new world. But the editor still refuses to leave, so Crenshaw shoots him.
Curt just happened to be passing by on his bike at this moment, and he runs over, wanting to know why Police Chief Crenshaw has shot a friend in cold blood. Curt asks if he's going to be shot too, and Crenshaw tells him that he is to be one of them, so he's free to go.
We can see that he's communicating with Zontar as he decides this, because he does have him at gunpoint, but then he apparently gets a countermanding order to not shoot him and to let Curt go. Because Curt is going to be one of us, whether he likes it or not. Keith's on his balcony with binoculars, looking pretty silly. He's scouting for injectopods flying through the air. He goes inside and tells Martha how they work, and we didn't really hear this in A Conquer the World. But after Zontar gives birth to these creatures out of his own body, they turn the victims, or the hosts, into extensions of Zontar. They're basically his eyes, ears, legs, and hands, going through town.
He explains that the people don't die, and Martha asks, but their minds, their personalities? And Keith explains that all emotions are gone. And if judging by this movie, I'm not sure they were ever there.
Not by the acting, that's for sure. And just like in A Conquer the World, Martha tries to trap Keith into admitting that he loves her, and love is an emotion, and that's not something they can just throw away. But Keith's not falling for it. Martha claims that this is a living death. No emotions, no love. She calls it a waste. It's unthanking. But Keith says it is what it is.
He says, I'm not making the rules. This is the way it has to be.
So Curt bikes up to the installation, gets to the gate. He's outside, and behind him we can see a highway with swiftly moving traffic.
Yeah, there's a couple of cars, a couple of trucks driving. So does Keith own all these vehicles?
He has a whole fleet of vehicles, I guess. He's met by the general, who tells him that he cannot go inside the installation. But he offers to drive him and Anne to the base, where everyone else is in that protective custody.
Curt happily accepts a ride, but then he wonders why the general's car is working.
He sees the little metal clip in the back of the general's neck. He figures out that the general is controlled by Zontar and lightly karate chops him on the back of the neck, which disables him, and he pushes him out of the Jeep.
But he grabs his gun in the process.
Yep, it apparently would work because whatever the general has does work. And Curt drives off.
Curt has gone directly to Keith's house.
He calls him an accessory to murder.
Keith tries to explain Zontar. He says that he's of a race born too soon and that their culture is millions of years beyond ours.
He also gives a little history. I don't think this was in A Conquer the World, where the ultra-intelligent creatures, of which Zontar is one, was controlling some lesser race of being on Venus, but somehow they burned through all of those lesser beings, and now they need a new supply of creatures to control. Thus, the trip to Earth, or something like that. I don't think he explained it that well.
Curt calls Keith a traitor and leaves. Martha comes in and says, I hope you're proud. But Keith is just sad because he's just lost a friend.
I think they were lost to each other long before this.
But Martha tells him that it's because Curt was his friend that Keith is still alive. She knows that Curt had a gun, but he didn't use it.
I didn't notice that Curt had a gun on him, but Martha was a lot closer than I was. Martha gets a little weepy here. She's in love with a monster, but she can't be in love with a monster. She just can't.
Keith starts to comfort her, but it doesn't last long because Zontar's calling.
Well, also, Keith says that we know what we're doing, and Martha is not ready to hear that. Keith starts talking to Zontar and tells him that he's troubled. He doesn't know if Zontar has a word for that in his sphere. He wants to meet Zontar, but Zontar nixes that idea. Then we find out that all the while that Keith and Curt were talking, Zontar was eavesdropping. He says something to Keith, but the upshot of it is that Curt must be controlled. The sooner the better.
Next we see Curt driving to his home in the general's Jeep. Curt goes inside and the house is dark. He goes on for Anne. She yells from the other room that she just had a shower.
This is very much like It Conquered the World. This whole scene plays out in almost exactly the same way. Curt, whose lighter works, fires up a cigarette, thinks for a second, and then wonders how Anne could possibly have taken a shower. There's no running water. She has some lame explanation about using water from the water heater. I wouldn't even know how to get water out of my water heater. And then rigging up a bucket in the shower or whatever. Then she comes out of the bathroom, hands behind her back, saying that she has a present for her husband. It's a surprise.
Without wasting any time, she brings her hands in front of her and tosses an injectopod out towards Curt. I just want to mention that this shot is lit exactly the way it is in It Conquered the World, but this shot looks so much more creepy in black and white than in color. It's more creepy and more effective. Anne says she's going to go for a walk.
She'll be back when the injectopod has done its dirty business. Curt grabs the fireplace poker and swings it at the injectopod. Doesn't really make any progress, but eventually he manages to stab it through the heart and down onto the fireplace.
He seems to be having a great time skewering it, but he's interrupted when the phone rings.
And again, I wonder, just like I did in It Conquered the World, how did they instantly know in less time than it would take to dial the telephone that the injectopod has been disabled? But we'll never get the answer to that question. Keith admits to Curt that he's not going to be able to be under their control for at least 12 hours. They have to make more injectopods first. So he should get in Anne's car and come over. Curt grips the general's gun and gleefully says that he'll be over, but he has an errand that he has to do first.
Keith informs Zontar that Curt is coming over, and Zontar informs Keith that he must kill Curt. Then Keith has to explain this to Martha.
We don't get to see that explanation, though. I'm sure it wouldn't have been very convincing anyways. But first we have to deal with Anne. Then Anne comes home. She smiles. She believes that she and her husband are both under Zontar's control now. They embrace, and Curt shoots her. He does look a little chagrined at this, though.
And now we see where the army is camped out. They're supposed to be out looking for unusual activities, and though one of them had reported seeing a funny-looking void, that didn't count.
In fact, they don't know why they are there. Now we're back at Keith and Martha's, where Keith is playing music on the only working reel-to-reel tape player in the entire world. Martha asks if Keith is done murdering for the day, and then we get a little exposition about the mayor and his wife, who died before they could be injectopoded.
He also gets some more detail on how the injectopods work and what the ultimate plan is here.
The ones meant for the mayor and his wife are going to be repurposed. They're going to the installation.
Let me cut back to the installation. There were 3 people under protective custody, 2 men and a woman. The woman comes out to find all the equipment back online.
She's so excited that she's going to make some coffee. The other scientists try to tell her, no, we don't need coffee. We don't want coffee. We've never liked coffee. But she says that she wants some for herself. As she goes to find these supplies, she opens a cabinet and there are 2 dead injectopods in there. She screams, and that's enough provocation for one of the scientists to choke her out. And she takes a very long time to die. I think this was a little more gruesome than in Conquered the World. I don't know about you.
I don't remember how they got her.
Well, I think
took her out in that.
I think it was less scary, but I think it was more prolonged. It was a pretty horrific scene in It Conquered the World, probably like the scariest scene in the whole movie, where the scientist is just choking his colleague to death. And here, it looks like they're not really applying full pressure, but it just takes a long time for her to die. She has her arm up into the frame where that's all we see, and then eventually she's finally done with life.
That's probably why it took longer if they weren't applying as much pressure.
Yeah. They could have shortened that up a little bit, though. At Keith's house, he's trying to get rid of Martha. He wants her to take a walk or something. She is surprised that he's still on board with this plan, but he tells her that he has the courage of his convictions. And then he goes off.
And while he's gone, she goes to the radio transceiver to talk to Zontar herself, and she threatens him.
And to make good on this threat, she goes out to the driveway. She sees that her car is blocked by Curt's. So she gets into the glove compartment of her car, takes out the instrument that we all have in our glove compartments, a handgun, and steals Curt's car.
Keith has just learned that Curt has killed his own wife, and he can't believe that this has happened. But Curt says that wasn't Anne anymore. So, no big deal.
He does read Keith the riot act for being a participant in this. at significant loss to himself.
Curt tries to convince Keith that he's being used by Zontar, but Keith's not feeling that.
Not yet, anyways. Now there's a bunch of quick cuts here.
We cut away to the soldiers. They're starting to get hungry. One of them hears a car.
We see Martha parking her car. Curt is still trying to convince Keith to not be a participant in this, and Keith is starting to get a little confused as to what's right here. And then we see Martha entering the cave. Back at Keith's house, Curt pulls a gun on him, and Keith says that Keith was supposed to kill Curt. Those were Zontar's orders.
At the cave, Martha announces that she's come there to kill Zontar. She sees him and screams.
Over the radio, Keith hears her screams, deduces it's Martha, and yells at her to run.
Now Martha is face to face with Zontar.
She calls him ugly and slimy, and she just about nails Beverly Garland's line from It Conquered the World, but not quite.
But she does it with a Texas accent.
She shoots at him, does nothing, and he advances on her, enfolds her in his giant bat wings, and we get a close-up on her face, which means that she's dead.
Keith is distraught.
Yeah, he hears this death, and now he's finally going to help Curt. So the two widowers split up. Curt's going to the installation, and Keith is going to the cave.
Curt offers his gun to Keith, but Keith says that guns aren't going to hurt Zontar. But he has something that will.
And this is different from It Conquered the World. He pulls a
beam gun, they call it.
Right, but he pulls it out of his radio set, as if it was powering that, or he was just hiding it there. It doesn't make any sense, really, but this is a laser with a plutonium ruby crystal that he designed himself. Even the government doesn't have anything of this caliber.
No, science has no idea of its existence, and this is the only thing on Earth powerful enough to destroy Zontar.
And I wonder, where did he get the plutonium? You can't just buy that at the grocery store.
I think you can get it if you're a scientist.
But he was a scientist without any kind of laboratory credentials.
Don't they have like Amazon for scientists?
In 1967?
Maybe, I don't know. I was never a scientist in 1967.
You were never anything in 1967. And I was a baby. So the soldiers who saw Martha's car head into the cave. One of the soldiers, the one who saw Martha's car and was searching for food, heads into the cave. And there he sees Zontar.
He heads back to his troop to inform his superior that he saw a monster in a cave.
They scoff at him, of course.
And correct his grammar.
His pronunciation, really. Keith drops Curt off at the installation. Curt goes in and sees the dead body of the lady scientist, and without much hesitation, just kills everybody inside, the general and the two male scientists. The general has a prolonged death scene where he flings himself into a piece of equipment, drags his hands down it, or starts sparking and catches on fire. And we see the little spark jumping between the two antennae of some radio set.
It's a Jacob's ladder.
Oh, it's a Jacob's ladder? Well, I'm glad you know more than I do. Before the general gets killed, and I guess Curt overheard this, the general is planning to take a briefcase full of explosives to meet the president and his cabinet and kill every living person in the room. And then Curt kills them all.
So after everybody's taken care of in the lab, the army troops are moving. They stop at what appears to be a cottage that is also the entrance to the cave.
It's a wood structure of some kind.
Keith, on his way to stop Zontar, is stopped by Police Chief Brad Crenshaw, but Keith takes care of him with his plutonium ruby laser beam.
Well, that was a test run for the laser, and it sure does work. And then Keith runs on since he can't drive. And now we see Keith enter the cave, and his entrance is like the underpass to a road. There's a cement archway that he goes under, and due to an editing error, he goes under not once, but twice. Now we see the soldiers walking through the cave. They go all the way through the labyrinthine trails of the cave, and we get to see every bit of it. Then one of the soldiers gets his ears boxed by Zontar, and they start shooting, but nothing happens. Leaving behind the dead soldier, the rest of them fall back.
Now Keith reaches Zontar. He uses his laser as Zontar is upon him, and the laser goes off, but we cut away so we don't get to see what happens.
No, but we do see that the lasers worked, and they were in a sort of lover's embrace when it happened. So there's not much left to this.
No, Curt approaches the cave.
He's stopped by a soldier. The soldier tells Curt he doesn't want to see what happened. It's not pretty.
He said that everyone is dead, and he acted like he knew that thing.
And Curt says he did. And then Curt does a voiceover monologue about man being the greatest creature in the universe, blah, blah, blah. It's like Peter Graves' monologue at the end of It Conquer the World, but different. And that's the end. Welcome back to the American International Podcast, where we're talking about Zontar, The Thing from Venus from 1967.
This is one of several remakes that Larry Buchanan produced for American International Pictures under his Azalea Films imprint during the late 1960s. In addition to Zontar, he made The Eye Creatures, which was a remake of Invasion of the Saucer Men, Creature of Destruction, a remake of The She Creature, Curse the Swamp Creature, a loose remake of Voodoo Woman, In the Year 2889, which is a remake of Day the World Ended, and Hell Raiders, which is a remake of Suicide Battalion.
Allegedly. We can't confirm that one. He also made Mars Needs Women from his own original script, and It's Alive, which was adapted from the Richard Matheson story Being.
According to Buchanan, AIP told him, "We want cheap color pictures, we want half-assed names in them, we want them 80 minutes long, and we want them now."
I did find a source that said AIP offered Buchanan $30,000 per film to make these movies, which was more than his previous budgets, but still an inadequate amount of money to make a quality product. Not that they asked for quality. However, I think the budget for Zontar was much lower, in the $20,000 range. At least that's what he spent. Maybe he skimmed the rest off the top.
AIP allegedly wanted the films to be shot in black and white. However, Buchanan insisted on using color, as affordable color film stock was becoming available, and the use of color television was taking off.
But that kind of flies in the face of them wanting color pictures for their syndication packages. So I guess we'll just have to say that both schools of thought exist, and we're not really sure which.
I intend to lean toward the idea that AIP wanted color, because otherwise why remake the pictures in the first place?
Right.
And 1966 was the first year that network television was 100% color. So this was 1967. By then, everybody was moving toward color. It would be a step back to go back to black and white.
Maybe this is just indication of AIP being cheap with these movies, and the black and white thing wasn't really true.
So if I look at a remake, I feel there has to be a reason for it, and that reason could be as simple as the original was in black and white, let's make one in color. But I think you need to add something to it, and I don't think whatever that is was one of the ingredients in Zontar, The Thing from Venus.
No, there were some superficial differences, but what wasn't different was the quality of the movie. It was a big step down from Roger Corman's picture in every category that you can rate a film on. The acting, the look of the movie, the sound.
What about the monster?
I guess you'd have to call that one a draw, because Beulah from It Conquered the World was ludicrous, and everyone calls it a carrot or a pickle. It didn't inspire a lot of terror in anybody. In our podcast, we told the story of how Beverly Garland said that she could knock it over with her handbag. So the monster in Zontar, it's very fake looking, but at least it's taller. It has like arm movement.
It's got wings. It's got three eyes.
Three eyes,
It's
yeah.
not something you'd want to bump into in a cave.
No, but it looks like a giant bat, basically made out of paper mache.
It looks more like something that would give birth to insectopods, whereas
that's true.
Those are very similar to what appeared in It Conquered the World.
And they did actually show them kind of fluttering off of its body. So I guess that added a little bit to it.
Yeah, there were a couple things that I thought were improvements, but there aren't many, and they're small. When Martha goes to the cave, she's got a handgun instead of a shotgun. That seemed a little more practical.
Right, but neither gun did any good, so it didn't really matter. If only she'd known about the plutonium ruby crystal. Of the actors, I thought the actress that played Martha was perhaps the third best in the movie. Obviously, John Agar is a professional actor, and the guy who played Keith, Anthony Huston, he's not great, but he does keep the mad scientist shtick going through the whole movie.
Well, nobody is really good. Even, I have to say, John Agar is not good in this. Nobody's good in this.
No,
all the line readings are very flat and dry. When I was joking there was no emotion, there is very little emotion in this film. The only thing that has any is Martha gets a little excited from time to time.
Well, she's very annoyed at her husband, and that's kind of I would call that an emotion.
Right. She's the only one who shows any emotion is what I'm saying.
So she's basically the audience stand-in, I think, where she has the emotional reaction to the world being taken over that everyone else should have.
And it's not, her reactions are not unreasonable, but compared to everybody else, it seems like she's overacting. She's probably really the only one who's acting. So it seems like she's overacting.
Or overreacting, too. But she's not. She is the only one making any sense, really. Curt spends most of the movie just trying to put Keith down. I think he wants the professional win more than he wants to save the world. Martha is the only one with the actual objection to Keith collaborating with an enemy that's going to wipe out mankind. She's the only one that shows any concern in that department. So she's kind of the heart of the movie, but unfortunately, she's only so-so.
Now, she doesn't come off as a badass like Beverly Garland did.
Well, who else could? There's just something that I love about Beverly Garland, and there's just no way to replicate that, especially on a $20,000 budget. So this is not the first Larry Buchanan movie that we're going to cover for our 10-week series.
Apologies in advance.
Yeah, I guess we're just going to have to get used to this style of filmmaking, if you want to call it a style, or this level of competence, maybe.
Well, you can blame part of that on the budget. These were shot on 16 millimeter, and it shows the audio isn't that great.
Conquer the World wasn't widescreen, and neither is this. And our dub of the movie was very washed out, a little muddy. But I still think if it was a good movie, that wouldn't have mattered.
What did you think about the introduction of the laser beam to kill Zontar, whereas they just used a blowtorch in It Conquered the World?
Well, I feel like they had to have something that was above and beyond an ordinary tool, because this is above and beyond an ordinary enemy. So even though it didn't really make a lot of sense that he just crafted this plutonium ruby, like, do those elements even go together? That he just crafted this gizmo out of stuff he found in the garage. At least they tried, and I guess this would be a Larry Buchanan writing this, at least they tried to add a little more scientific know-how. With Keith being such a brilliant scientist, he should have something that you and I couldn't just rustle up. I don't know, do you have a different opinion?
No, I would agree with that. If we're going to compare the cast, we already said we can't compare Beverly Garland. John Agar really is no replacement for Peter Graves.
Well, I didn't think Peter Graves was that amazing in the movie either.
I wouldn't think so, but compared to John Agar, he's really good.
Well, I know we're damning him with faint praise, but...
And Lee Van Cleef just seemed like such a weasel. And the character Keith Ritchie is essentially the same character. He doesn't look as much like a weasel, but he still has a very punchable face.
And in both instances, it's really hard to see what the wife character sees in her traitor, weird husband. I would have given up after the first, oh, you're talking to another planet? Okay. Oh, they're going to take us over? That's not cool. I would have given up on my husband long before that if he was up to such nonsense. All right, well, it's obvious that we don't have a high opinion of this movie, but let's categorize it. Using our AIP scale, where A is awesome, I is intermediate, and P is pathetic, how would you rate Zontar, the Thing from Venus, Jeff?
Well, as I said, I can't help but compare it to the original, It Conquered the World, and I gave that movie an A. And this makes me want to reassess that rating, because the reason I gave it an A was because I said it had a really strong story that went above the acting and the effects. And this is the exact same story, but it didn't fly with me. It was dull. I know this movie has a cult following from people who saw this when it first aired on television.
When they were kids.
When they were kids, yeah. I can't even imagine me being that interested in this as a kid.
No, it's so inert.
As I said, the line readings are just so dry. And it's almost a surreal experience watching this movie.
Like you slipped into an alternate dimension where things are the same but different.
Yeah. So it's still a strong story, even if it's not presented well in this case. So I'm going to give Zontar, the Thing from Venus, an I. How do you rate it, Cheryl?
Well, I did like the story, but I think what made it conquer the world in A Picture for me was the acting. And I think, again, I just love Beverly Garland, so her spirit carried the movie. And in this movie, Patricia Delaney as Martha, her spirit couldn't take it that far. And it's really hard for me to find anything good to say about it. I don't know. I figure I should give this an I because it's a decent story and a good sci-fi film, and I like sci-fi. But I think I'm going to give it a P because it just comes off as so inept. A good director should be able to coax his actors into a line reading that has feeling. It could be contempt. It could be anger. It could be disgust. It could be boredom. It could be annoyance. But it shouldn't just be someone reading out of the telephone book.
Well, maybe it was boredom.
Well, why are they bored? The world is being taken over. Everything has changed. Existence as we know it is crumbling. And yet these people sound like they just could not be bothered. And it's not just the police chief and the general and the scientist. It's even Anne and Keith. There's just not enough there. I just want more in everything. Technically, it's not great. The story is stolen, so Buchanan gets no credit for that. And their performances are so dull. I can't even bump it up to an I. Sorry.
You don't need to apologize to me.
All right, well, I think that wraps up our episode on Zontar, The Thing from Venus. I'm Cheryl Lightfoot.
And I'm Jeff Markin.
And until next time, stay tuned.
Follow the American International Podcast on Instagram and Letterboxd at AIP_pod and on Facebook at facebook.com/American International Podcast.
The American International Podcast is produced and edited by Jeff Markin.
A man whose mind is distorted by hatred.
And Cheryl Lightfoot.
A girl hungry for too many things.
The American International Podcast is part of the Pop Culture Entertainment Network.